Welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today we are interviewing Tom Torbeyns. Tom Torbeyns is an open theist from Belgium, and he runs the website Cross Theology. So, Tom, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Tom Torbeyns, and I run Cross Theology, as you've already said. So this is, I think, I'm now like 1 year and 2 months or something. I'm an open theist. Before I was a classical, you could say Arminian, concerning God's knowledge of the future. That's a short introduction, I think. So
that's a short introduction. So, what brought you to the open theist viewpoint?
So last year I was, I think on Facebook there was someone told me about open theism. I don't know which individual that was, and then I downloaded a book by Michael Saya. And I read the introduction. It's called "Does God Know the Future?"
Yeah, very good book.
Yeah, it's a very good book. I only read the introduction, and then I watched an introductory video by Jesse Morrell. It's about an hour long. It's called "Why I Am an Open Theist," I think, and it was very good. Then I did some Bible study on it, and then I read the whole of "Does God Know the Future?" And I was convinced of the truth. I was like, well, this framework makes more sense with the Bible compared to other frameworks. And also back in high school, I was quite, I was very convinced of Christianity. Actually, I was a Christian for some years, but there was one question that kept on bothering me, on which I wanted an answer, and that was, if God knows the future, why does he create those babies, or those souls, you could say, of which he knows that they will go to hell?
And yeah, definitely. It's kind of a shocking concept in itself, that God creates people knowing that they're just going to go to hell.
Yeah. And so I thought always, like, okay, there's a free will. That's the way Arminians are taught to answer that, you could say. And so that's like in most theological schools, like systems, you get that answer, but it didn't really satisfy. And I think open theism, I mean, I just never thought of the how do you put this, the concept that maybe God doesn't know the future, and so I never considered that. But then once I realized that, I was like, whoa, this really answers the question, and it fits so well in the Bible. It's like,
right. So open theism, I guess, is not native in Belgium. You don't know any other open theists there?
No, not that I know of. I know from the Netherlands, there's a brother Andrew. I think he's an open theist. He was a famous guy. I don't know if you know him.
But it's not a big movement.
No, not at all.
All right. And so Calvinism, is that more natural?
That's more in Holland. In Belgium, it's more Roman Catholicism. It's huge, you could say. And Protestantism is just small. That's more like your fundamentalist type Protestant. You could say like evangelical, right. Pentecostal.
So tell us about your website.
So my website is Cross Theology. You can go to crosstheology.com or crosstheology.wordpress.com, and it has many articles now. It's been up for 1 year now, and just a variety of theological subjects. So it's just more on just theology in a broad sense, many different viewpoints, like you have like Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals, evangelicals, Roman Catholics, Orthodox. You have many different viewpoints, and it's more like you could say like a collection kind of.
Yeah, it seems that way. It looks like you have things sorted in different categories, and people could pick up their different topics and then see excerpts from what other people around the world say about those topics.
Yeah, you could put it that way. Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
Sounds good. So has your website reached anyone? Have you converted anyone to open theism?
Yeah. People have read it, and they've told me, like, well, this is also a system that works with the Bible, and especially with the doctrine of original sin. I personally don't believe in it, and how can I put this? The ideas I put down there. Many people have told me, like, well, when I consider this, I think you're right. Like open-minded people.
Right. For those listening who don't understand what that is about, there's this doctrine in Christianity of original sin, that people inherit sin through the lineage of Adam, and that's said to be either inherent in our flesh or descending from Adam's rebellion in the garden. And some open theists, Tom Torbeyns, Jesse Morrell, even myself, I kind of reject this because it sounds like this Platonic idea where the flesh is evil. And I think that's how it really took off in early Christianity. The flesh was evil, so we have this original sin, and our nature is tainted and our flesh is tainted. Whereas a more biblical perspective is each man is guilty for their own sins.
Yeah. You see this doctrine already. This is just from head knowledge, but I can remember that it seems like Origen in one he kind of said, like, in a sense he said you could say would say yes, and on the other hand he would say no. He said something like that the children are born with the stain from Adam or something, but on the other hand he also said that there are learned Greeks like who say that the soul of children that they are actually from the devil, you could say. But he said he rejected this, and he said, like, their angels, their guardian angels, you could say, they always look to God the Father, and like it was a way of saying, like, okay, they are not going to hell. So I think he might have been more into the ancestral sin from the Eastern Church. But you already see that Gnosticism kind of.
Right, and usually when people are trying to defend this concept from the Bible, they'll turn to the writings of Paul, and it would be pretty much an exclusive Pauline doctrine if it was a doctrine. But the way in which Paul writes is he mixes metaphors and he uses allusions, and he turns pagan concepts on their heads to illustrate Christian truths. So, you probably need something a little bit more than a vague reference in Paul in order to make a solid doctrine like that. And it should be consistent in whoever you're trying to find it, and it should be fairly explicit, which it's not, and you don't find it in the rest of the Bible. You find Cain, and God's talking to Cain, and he says, sin is crouching at your door, and you need to control it. You need to be master of it. And Cain is after the fall in the Garden of Eden, and God still is under this assumption that, we are responsible for our own choices.
See that God really expects Cain to obey. I mean, God is not joking like, well, I already know the future, so Cain, please don't do that, but I know you will do that. So I'm very sorry, you're going to go burn in hell forever. Sorry, man. Baby, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And also, when I try to disprove this doctrine, nowadays I often start in Romans 5, which is the proof text, you could say. Romans 5 verses, what is it? Like from 12 till the end of the chapter, I think. It's like the proof text. And but it doesn't really work because if you're a Calvinist, you could make it work, you could say, or a Universalist. Then you would say, like, the sin of Adam is imputed to us without our free choice. In the same way, the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us. But then, like when you see the words all and many in that comparison, then you would have to conclude that God in the end will save all, which is not biblical, or that there must be a choice to be like Adam and to receive the righteousness of Christ, you could say.
And so that's Romans 5:12. It says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. So Paul here, he's not really teaching some sort of inherited sin nature. His point is to Israel, and he's trying to put Israel on the same level as the Gentiles. And so it's almost a stretch, I'd say, to pull that out and try to make some sort of doctrine of original sin. And there should be something a little bit more substantial if that's going to be a biblical doctrine that that we need to be, that we're holding on to and teaching.
I mean, if you read, for example, Ezekiel 18, it is very clear that the son shall not inherit the iniquity of the father, and and also not the other way around. But then people say, well, that's true. I don't inherit the sin of my father, but I do inherit it of Adam. But it's like, then there would be a contradiction, because then if Cain would use that verse, then he would not inherit the sin of Adam. You know what I mean? It's like,
right. So that there are open theists, and I think of Bob Enyart in particular, because he just had a podcast or a radio show just 2 weeks ago, and it was on the flesh of Jesus coming in the flesh. And he proposes this system where sin is passed through the line of the Father. And since Jesus doesn't have a human father, then the sin line of Adam doesn't flow to Jesus. That's what he proposes. And I think it's mostly speculation. I mean, if it's a system and it works for him, that's fine. But I don't think that's something we should be trying to press as the de facto biblical doctrine. And I don't even know if it works on a logical level, how sin just passes through the male line, you know?
Yeah, I would say that that's like I would say the classical, or at least where I live, is the classical idea of and I've also been to Africa, and there they say the same, the classical idea of Protestantism of people inheriting sin. It's like, oh, well, Jesus didn't have a father. We all do have a human father, so therefore we inherit sin, and Jesus does not inherit sin. But the thing is, the Bible nowhere says you shall inherit the sin from your father. On the contrary, like Ezekiel 18, as I already mentioned,
right,
says the opposite. So it's like,
yeah. So tell us about your time in Africa. You went ministering to some very poor people, right? And you talked to them about the Bible.
Yeah. It was in Cameroon, and yeah, I've been sharing the gospel there. Preaching.
Did you have translators that you worked through?
When I just walked on the streets, I just spoke in French. I know a little bit of French. But when we were in the crusade, you could say, like the evangelism crusade, there I used a translator because I'm more comfortable in English than in French.
Yeah. So were they very receptive to what you're trying to say?
Well, it's kind of like I preached a little bit against the doctrine of original sin. I mean, in the sense of just telling the people, like, look, you are responsible for your own sin, and God is going to judge you if you don't repent. But then I had the mic, so they couldn't stop me, kind of. So.
Right. So did you talk to them about the nature and character of God at all and open theism?
Open theism was not really I didn't really use that there. I
Okay.
more privately spoke about that.
So they all were under the impression that there was original sin. Is that the case?
Yeah, there was. One guy he showed me. It was like a teacher in the church, and he showed me his papers, and he asked me, "Do you please want to look into this?" I said, "Okay." I read it, and it was quite good. I was like quite like you always hear of Africa. Well, they don't, but
right.
It was quite good, And so I was quite pleased. But then I turned some pages, and then I was like on original sin, and that was really like, oh no, it really sounds Gnostic, And they believe they say that sin is in your DNA, or some say in your blood.
Right. Do you see a lot of fatalism in their teachings?
Well, that was more like a holiness church, so it didn't really. That conclusion wasn't drawn. Like it was. They believe in holiness, but it's kind of illogical to use both sides. Like you have to sin and you have to be holy, kind of.
Right. And so you would say they believed in kind of a free will combined with original sin.
Yes.
So you currently attend a seminary. Is that the case?
Yes, Continental Theological Seminary in St. Peter's Leeuw, close to Brussels, in Belgium.
All right. And you're saying that a lot of your professors are the Calvinist types?
Yes, some are. Others are Armenian, classical Armenian.
And how have they treated you in your interactions with them?
You could say there's a general tendency of respect between all of us. But some don't really like open theism.
Well, do they tolerate it? Do they accept it? Do they give you bad grades because of it? Do you feel any backlash?
No, I don't think they will give me, or they gave me bad grades. I think they try to be honest people. But what I will say, one teacher, and I won't name any names, one teacher, he last year he said twice in class that open theism is heresy. And in the beginning of this year, like this school here. He said, well, open theism isn't a heresy, but we shouldn't consider it orthodoxy. So it's outside of orthodoxy. And he also told me that he's a little bit worried about my salvation. I believe in open theism. And he saw it as a primary issue. I told him that I saw it as more as secondary. To me, a classical Arminian can also be saved. I mean, if you have more like the view that God does know the future, it doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't directly change your salvation or something. So
yeah, so this guy was a Calvinist, right?
Yes.
The Calvinist position seems to be that open theists aren't saved, but they kind of throw a bone, or they're a little bit inconsistent towards Arminians. And if you really press the Calvinists who say open theists aren't saved, they'll kind of say that Arminians aren't saved as well, because they're kind of lumped together. But because Arminianism has such a following, they're not going to try to overtly disclude them from, being considered a Christian.
Yeah, I think that is just I think the amount of people that are a member of it. If there are more people in one camp, that doesn't make it truth, but it seems like they tolerate it then.
Yeah, so my contention is if these Calvinists ever came to power and stamped out Arminianism, they would declare Arminianism a heresy, just on equal level as open theism.
Yeah, I guess so. Like my school is part of the Assemblies of God. Already some people have expressed, they have expressed doubt is not really the word. It's like they were quite afraid, you could say, that Calvinism would infiltrate the Assemblies of God. And it seems to be a revival of Calvinism going on. And
revival of Calvinism, that sounds scary. I used to attend Assemblies of God church in college, and that was actually pretty good. The preacher was ex-Roman Catholic, and so he had a lot of good insights. And it's Assemblies of God, and Assemblies of God seems to be more of a charismatic, speaking in tongues type. But the church I attended, he was, he came from this Roman Catholic background, and he wasn't charismatic at all. And he wasn't charismatic in the speaking in tongues sense, and he would just give straight sermons and kind of an interesting dynamic that he was part of the Assemblies of God. But I really liked my time with them.
I would say also with a friend of mine, Michael is his name, is from the Czech Republic. He's we would say on the intellectual side, and me too, in the sense of like Assemblies of God is a classical Pentecostal denomination, and throughout history, like last century, they don't exist that long. They have been known sometimes for being anti-intellectualists, and that's sad actually. And we try to change that to be like speaking in tongues and all that. We keep that, but we also like to do the intellectual studies and
Yeah, I think there's definitely a good mix. Currently, I attend the Vineyard churches, and the Vineyard churches, they're also speaking in tongue, charismatic type, but it's more of on a download thing. When you kind of read Paul about this, Paul says, don't really do this in church because people are going to walk in and they're going to think you're crazy. And so the Vineyard position is, we'll do this stuff and speaking in tongues and, but they do it kind of in their own groups and not in public places.
There are certain rules with Paul, you could say, or advices. Some don't take it as rules, but take it more as advice, which is also a possible interpretation. But I would also say that the gift should not be quenched, because it can also happen. Paul gives that example that an unconverted guy, a guy who's not a Christian, comes into the church, and some people start to prophesy about him. So they speak the truth of God, what God knows of that guy, which the others couldn't know, some secret sin in his life or something, and the guy gets converted. It does happen.
Right. I'll quick interject with one of my humorous anecdotes from Portland. I was living in Portland for about 6 months, and I kept checking out all these churches, trying to find the right church in the Portland, Vancouver type area. And, one church I went to, it was a pretty good church. And I talked to the pastor after the first sermon, and he's talking to me, and he's like, and I'm talking to him about my current studies, and I'm currently studying like speaking in tongues. And I told him about my conviction that speaking in tongues were known foreign languages. Like when you see Pentecost, the disciples, they're speaking in tongues, but everyone understands them in their own language. And so I was saying, it could be known foreign tongues, and the interpreters would be interpreting languages that they know. And the pastor got real quiet, and he was like, speak in tongues here. I'm like, oh. And so I ask him, did you do what Paul said to do? Paul said to use a translator. Always use a translator. And so you have one person speaking in tongues, and then you have one person telling everyone what it means, as so it's not gibber. And he's like, he's a little sheepish, and he's like, yeah, we do that. And the very next Sunday, I'm there, and this guy stands up during prayer time, and he just goes on. He's speaking in tongues. It's almost like a Russian type of language that you kind of hear his accent going on. And he carries on for, it seemed like 5 minutes. It was a long time. And so then he sits down, and the pastor, he kind of recollects that I had confronted him earlier, just the previous week, about the same topic. And I said that, do you guys interpret it? And so he asked the guy, he said, Brother Mike, I'm making up the name Mike. I don't know what the guy's name was, but he said, Brother Mike, could you tell everyone kind of what you just said there? And the guy, he was like confused. And he'd never been asked this before in his life, because a lot of times these charismatic churches, they'll never have an interpreter, ever. It's kind of the exact opposite of what Paul said. And so he stands up, and he's confused, and he just kind of looks around. He's like, God be with us. And then he sits down. So 5 minutes of speaking in tongues, God be with us.
I would say that there is, okay, sorry to kind of ruin your joke or something, but
no, it's all good.
But there have been cases in Pentecostal churches where people spoke. I mean, it doesn't have to be like you speak like 5 words in tongues, and then it's like 5 words translation. It's more like the translation is not a translation, because I used the wrong term here, but it's an interpretation. So
right, but sometimes people just talk crazy talk, and then when you watch their actions, if they're confronted to have to explain what they were talking about, and it's just mass confusion, and no one knows what he's talking about, then you kind of suspect maybe that wasn't necessarily legit speaking in tongues. Not saying that there's not legitimate speaking in tongues, that somewhere some people are speaking in angelic languages or whatnot, but you kind of get a sense that not all of it's 100% kosher.
Oh yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, I believe there are a lot of scammers, and for example, you say like, and it's true, like in charismatic churches or Pentecostal churches, people are encouraged to speak in tongues, but not so often to interpret. And I think maybe the problem lays there, because if nobody tells you you can interpret, then you won't do it. I mean, I notice in Belgium, there's like pastors are often encouraged, which is good, but prophets or evangelists, those ministries, they aren't very much encouraged, and I think
right,
do something with that. I don't know.
So I think in everything, like even like healing, when people say, oh, the Benny Hinn's of the world saying, oh, I could heal everyone, I got the spirits of healing. There's scammers, and then there's people who think they can, but they can't. And then there's the legit people. And so we always have to kind of filter out who's the scam artists, who are just clueless, and who are the people who are legit,
Yeah, it's true. I've heard, for example, I'm just going to give an example of Benny Hinn. Well, maybe it's hard to judge, but I've seen videos, maybe they were cut out of context. I don't know. People can look into this themselves, but I've seen videos where he says like, well, if you pay $1,000, then I might be mistaken. Maybe it was another person, but it was something like, if you give $1,000, you will be healed. Well, you can clearly see that's just scam. That's just for their own profit. But I've been on the streets and I've been praying for people and they got healed. They never paid me 1 cent, and I never asked them to get paid or something. It was just to get their souls right with God, you could say.
Yeah, so. No, that sort of stuff is legit. But whenever someone asks for the money, the Benny Hinns, the Mike Murdochs of the world, definite scam artists. These people who are obsessed with material wealth, and they live in these fancy houses, and they're incredibly fat, the John Hagees of the world. It's like, oh man, I can't take them seriously. But when people have personal testimonies about praying for people that they don't even know and getting those people healed, that's when you kind of realize that, there's probably some divine action behind that.
I mean, I believe in those spiritual gifts. I had a word of knowledge once. I said to a lady something about her youth or something. I never met that lady, but I just said it and she started to cry. I was like, oh God, what did I just do? So I'm kind of shocked. Yeah, but those are ways of, in which God can testify about himself, I think, through us. So.
Yeah. So would you say that most of the churches in your area are a little bit charismatic, or are they more traditional Reformed?
The whole of Belgium, you have the biggest church is the Roman Catholic Church. That's been so. And but then if you look in Protestantism, we shouldn't forget the Orthodox Church, of course. But if you look in Protestantism, I think there are two big groups. I'm not sure, but I think there are two big groups. The evangelicals, those are more the conservative. Most of them are conservative, like, no spiritual gifts, no speaking in tongues. And then you have or for example, I have to be a minister, an evangelist to share the gospel. And they can go quite extreme in the cessationist thing, or the with the kind of without miracles and,
right,
just a pastor or something like traditional more. And then on the other hand, you have more the Pentecostals, and they are more like, well, there are still spiritual gifts. We can still go and pray for the sick, or stuff like that.
So what's your exposure to philosophical side of open theism, to the Haskers, to the Boyds, to the Ords of the world?
I think, I like philosophical aspects, but I think I'm more of a biblical guy. If from what I remember of your podcast, more like Jesse Morrell type of guy, like closer to that side of open theism.
Right.
Yeah.
So the main open theism Facebook page, just called Open Theists, I was on there, and I had just assumed that everyone was biblical open theists. And so when I first joined, that was 3 years ago, something like that, or 3 or 4. And pretty quickly, I found out that wasn't the case. Like, I started talking about Moses's conversations with God, and how you prioritize in the text God speaking versus the narrator versus the things that are said by the characters in the book. And I got a lot of pushback. And they said, you really think God said that? You think God said that? And then I got you think God speaks English? Like, what the heck are you guys talking about?
He spoke in Old King James Version.
Yeah, it's like, he spoke in English. I'm like, no, I don't think you guys have a fundamental misunderstanding about how language works. And so you don't have to repeat verbatim in the original language in order to say someone said something. If you say something to me and Dutch and I translate to English, I could say Tom said this, and even though I'm speaking English, that's still that. And so their concern just was a fundamental misunderstanding of language, but their overarching concern that the conversation never happened, that was kind of shocking to me. I'm like,
oh yeah, I never noticed that.
Yeah, it's like, all right, I think the conversation's done because I don't know where to go from here.
Yeah. That's Facebook. That's just Facebook land, such conversations. And then they don't know what to say, and then they're like, oh, you're just a heretic. And then 5 other people, yeah, you're just a heretic. And it's like, okay. And then they're like, we won. Huh. It's very funny to me.
So yeah, that what struck me though is the open theist side. I'm like, why is there this weird hostility in open theism towards other open theists, especially open theists who take seriously the text of the Bible? And I just didn't get it. So that's one thing I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bridge the gap and create some unity. And so we're just not attacking each other, just lashing out for just random nonsense reasons.
I just don't get it. I had one guy once writing something like, if you guys are such great missionaries, why are you guys always on Facebook fighting each other instead of, you don't have time to share the gospel. And I was like, whoa, that guy really has a good point. What are you guys wasting your time about?
I definitely think it's good to listen to our critics. Someone who doesn't agree with you, they're coming from a different perspective. They're bringing a different point of view. And sometimes they can point out to us stuff that are so obvious that we miss it ourselves because we are so bogged down in our own little worlds, our own point of views. And so that's why it's important to read Calvinists and to read atheists and read biblical scholars, even biblical scholars who reject the Bible, because what they bring to the debate, what they bring is a fresh perspective, a perspective that's not necessarily embroiled in all these petty disputes, and they're usually seeking to try to discredit or disprove or even trying to objectively look at the material.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I had it with, it was not that I was like a stubborn guy in this or something, but with for example, whether God does or does not know the future. In the past, I just thought he knows because he's God. You know, that's what that's what they've always taught you, how to read the Bible. But then later on, someone else comes and he says, well, maybe it's not the case like that. And then you reconsider this. And I think it was Charles Finney who said that a Christian should always reconsider what he believes and put to the test, and he should not be scared to revise doctrines and to just come up with other conclusions. And I totally agree with that.
If only more Christians thought like that. So my guest today has been Tom Torbeyns of Cross Theology. If you have any questions or comments on this podcast, you can list those on our God is Open website or the God is Open Facebook companion website. So thank you for listening.